Welcome to On What Slender Threads. My name is Lynn. The next three presentations will be a bit longer. It is in traditions 7, 8, and 9 that Bill was fleshing out the structure of our society. Recall that our society is the worldwide fellowship of AA, and that in his essay on unity in the first tradition, he emphasized the hammering out of the structure of AA. This presentation is on Tradition 7. It's based on a book that I wrote, On What Slender Threads, AA's 12 Traditions from a Historical Perspective. However, it's not necessary to buy the book unless you would like to have it as a resource. It is my hope these video presentations will highlight what I learned from studying research on AA's early history from the literature available at the General Service Office of Alcoholics Anonymous, and from the experiences and insights of AA friends around the world. I am not a spokesperson for AA. Any inferences in this study are strictly my own and in no way reflect the opinion of Alcoholics Anonymous. I hope it will be helpful. We explored traditions 1 through 5, or how AA groups relate to each other. Unity means we have a voice on AA policy. The informed group conscience helps us to express that voice. There's membership, a simple membership requirement, and there's autonomy for delivering the group's message and for our primary purpose. Tradition 6 marks the beginning of how AA relates to the world outside by not relating to the world outside through affiliation with outside entities and related enterprises, thus avoiding problems with money, property, and prestige. So, after a preamble that seems to suit Tradition 7, we'll examine why more was needed to be said about the problems with money. Our spiritual way of life is safe for future generations if, as a society, we resist the temptation to receive money from the outside world. But this leaves us with a responsibility, one that every member ought to understand. We cannot skimp when the treasurer of our group passes the hat. Our groups, our areas, and AA as a whole will not function unless our services are sufficient and their bills are paid. When we are generous with the hat, we give a token that we are grateful for our blessings and evidence that we are eager to share what we have found with all those who still suffer. Tradition 7 says every AA group ought to be fully self-supporting, declining outside contributions. Like Tradition 6, this was a significantly trimmed-down version of the original form. Keeping in mind that Bill peddled the 12 points in their original form while he was trying to sell the idea of a conference of delegates from AA groups. This would be the guardrails that the conference would have to follow, and it's particularly evident in the original forms. It will emphatically repeat Tradition 6's hazards of affiliating with outside entities or related enterprises. So here is that somewhat repetitious declaration in the beginning of the original form. Bill had written, the AA groups themselves ought to be fully supported by the voluntary contributions of their own members. We think that each group should soon achieve this ideal. Notice that phrase seems to acknowledge the financial help that early AA needed to have to get started. That any public solicitation of funds using the name of Alcoholics Anonymous is highly dangerous, whether by groups, clubs, hospitals, or other outside agencies. That acceptance of large gifts from any source or of contributions carrying any obligation, whatever, is unwise. So AA groups avoid trouble by not accepting money from outside sources. But Bill went on to make a particular point about how AA groups avoid trouble while handling their own money. He continued in the original point, then too we view with much concern those AA treasuries which continue beyond prudent reserves to accumulate funds for no stated AA purpose. Experience has often warned us that nothing can so surely destroy our spiritual heritage as feudal disputes over property, money, and authority. When I look at this original point in the light of the guardrails that the conference would have to follow, Bill is assuring the groups that the conference will not accrue too much money, that they will have a prudent reserve. Well, let's go on to think about or see what Bill has to say about that in his essay, and then we'll look at its history. He says, self-supporting alcoholics, who ever heard of such a thing? And when a society composed entirely of alcoholics is going to pay its bills, that's really news. And certainly people thought that it was time now sober that we paid our own way, and that's going to come out very clearly in our early history. So our fellowship stayed poor because it had to. And then another reason for our collective poverty, while alcoholics would spend lavishly on 12th step cases, they had a terrific aversion to dropping money into the meeting place hat for group purposes. So as Bill says, the AA movement started and stayed broke, while its individual members waxed prosperous. He said that as AA emerged from its infancy into adolescence, we swung from the idea that we needed vast sums of money to the notion that AA shouldn't have any. It was like a pendulum, lots and lots of money to absolutely none at all. Some of the naysayers would say, you can't mix AA and money. We shall have to separate the spiritual from the material. And there were members that had tried to make money out of their AA connections early on. Bill said we feared we'd be exploited. And then they ran into the problem of benefactors who had endowed clubhouses, and they noticed that as a result, there was sometimes outside interference in our affairs. He talked about one AA group being given $5,000, and the hassle over that chunk of money played havoc for years. Frightened by these complications, some groups refused to have a cent in their treasuries. But then Bill says AA had to function. Meeting places cost. To save whole areas from turmoil, small offices had to be set up. We saw that if they weren't, the man coming in the door couldn't get a break. These simple services required small sums of money which we could and would pay ourselves. He then goes on to how they learned this hard lesson with Jack Alexander's Saturday Evening Post piece, prompting thousands of frantic letters from distraught alcoholics. He said we'd have to have some more full-time help, that was for sure. And so he said, we went out and we asked AA members for voluntary contributions. Would they send us $1 a member a year? Well, to my surprise, the response of the groups was slow. And I got mighty sore about it. I think that's along the line of being judgmental. So he goes into a story about how alcoholics' egos gets entangled with money. He talks about a prize slippee that came inside his office, and he produced a $5 bill. The intense relief on my friend's face warmed my heart. I felt especially virtuous. The meeting that night, though, was at the New York's old 24th Street Clubhouse, and the treasurer gave a timid talk. Now, boys, could you go heavier on the hat tonight, will you? As Bill says, he fumbled with a 50-cent piece and hastily dropped it back and fished out a dime, which clinked thinly as he dropped it in the hat. He realized that his $5 gift to the slippee was an ego-feeding proposition. Bad for him and bad for me. This was the place where money and spirituality would mix. and that was in the hat. But Bill had one other story that he needed to go into because by 1948, there were members who were passing on and gratefully trying to endow Alcoholics Anonymous with large gifts. He mentions a member gave a sum of $10,000, and the question was, should AA take the gift? What a debate we had on that one. The foundation was really hard up then. So here he goes again with that group conscience working and discussing the issue. Yes, let's take the money. But then came the opposition. So important to pause and see if there's any opposition. The foundation already knew of a total of $500,000 set aside for AA and the wills of people still alive. And this would be disastrous because while this bequest wasn't that much, but unlike the alcoholic's first drink, it would, if taken, inevitably set off a chain reaction. All the alcoholics, relieved of the responsibility, would shrug and say, oh, the foundation's wealthy. Why should I bother? The board would then be isolated and would fall under heavy attack of criticism. So they declared, the trustees, that AA must always be poor, that bare running expenses plus a prudent reserve would be the foundation's financial policy. The principle of corporate poverty was firmly and finally embedded in AA tradition, and it generated a wave of confidence in the integrity of Alcoholics Anonymous. He said, indeed, the irresponsible had become responsible. Well, when I was invited by a judge to visit with you all in AA, one of my first critiques as a slip signer who was still drinking was, does anyone know what is going on with the money in that basket that's going around here? I'm thinking this while I'm eyeing the basket that's being passed around and fingers are being dipped in and out, and I'm saying there's no control here. That recollection spurred me to call this chapter, Thanks for the Meeting. Who's picking up the tab? In his essay on this tradition, Bill uses his own flawed experience to characterize how alcoholics have a distorted entanglement with money and their egos. Even in the earliest days, Bill and Hank Parkhurst were keenly aware of how money is, at least to an alcoholic, a dubious luxury. Now, keep in mind, the Big Book was published in April 10, 1939. Let's flash back to a little bit more than a year. In early March 1938, Hank and Bill realized that a donation from Rockefeller was imminent. While the two men spent some time discussing the idea of a foundation to oversee the donation, what I did not know was that it was actually Hank who took the lead in the fellowship's financial future. He was the first to codify what would be AA's policies on fiscal responsibility. In March 1938, Hank introduces the fund in a letter he prepared for Frank Amos. Hank urged careful consideration in creating the guidelines for the fund, as one day he believed it would serve as a national model for future AA financial policies. And in fact, we will see that this did bear out in AA's future. Hank said the fund would oversee the collection and distribution of monies for supporting alcohol recovery-related work while diligently avoiding professionalism. Hank was just barely getting started. He said only those who benefited from the program could donate. Now, Hank defined those who benefited from the program a little bit more broadly than we do today. He thought that should be individuals and businesses. And this makes sense. It nicely fit with Hank's aspiration in his chapter that he wrote to the employers, which began with individual employer-employee interventions and extended to training junior executives to aid alcoholic employees. Obviously, the book would be an essential tool for employers to carry out his suggestion, and that meant huge sales. So, while AA would ultimately eschew the idea of businesses as benefactors of the program, 30 years later, the Comprehensive Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism Prevention, Treatment, and Rehabilitation Act of 1970 would pave the way for public and private institutions to explore alcohol research and education. But let's get back to the fund. Hank also stipulated that outside donations would be accepted with the intent to pay back, which is unusual. I mean, really, it's extraordinary. A donation is a donation, right? But somehow these early members knew it was essential for recovering alcoholics to pay their own way. Hank finally stipulated that the fund would have oversight by a disinterested party who is not an alcoholic, with a significant business background preferred. That last stroke of genius would be the early fellowship's saving grace, and years later it would be an almost insurmountable barrier against alcoholics gaining full responsibility for the program. Hank sent his ideas to Amos on March 16, 1938, and then on March 17th, the very next day, Rockefeller Jr. donated $5,000 and said, "This is a one-time donation. There will be no more." Now, that is equivalent to about $116,000 today. So it was a generous donation, and it was not out of line with what the Rockefellers usually did. They believed in providing seed money to get good projects started. Their expectation was that the project would sustain itself after the initial investment. Discouraging as this must have been, Hank formally established the Alcoholic Fund on March 21, 1938, and asked a non-alcoholic disinterested party, Frank Amos, to oversee the contribution from Rockefeller. Well, over the next 4 months, Hank and Bill tried to find other sources of income, and they started crafting the book. Bill wrote his story, and there is a solution, which in June 1938, Hank decided to craft into a neatly gotten up brochure to attract more donations. I mean, these guys were relentless, and Ruth Hawk is working right along with them every step of the way. But they can't seem to get their hands on any more substantive donations. In August 5th, 1938, Hank, with non-alcoholic lawyer John B. Wood, changed the fund to the Alcoholic Foundation, with the expectation that the foundation would raise $15,000 for the book. Remember, the 5K donation, Bill and Hank had sort of given up hospitals and sanitariums, but that did not mean that they'd given up hope for more money. So the Alcoholic Foundation, with its larger funds, would offer a tax-exempt status, which lends an air of credibility, and the foundation's board would be populated by a few more well-connected trustees who might have better luck raising funds than two newly recovered broke alcoholics. Hank was thinking. Then Hank and John Wood crafted a model for establishing a proportion of alcoholic trustees and non-alcoholic trustees. The proportion had changed over the years, which we'll talk about later, but the designation remains the same even today. Class A trustees are non-alcoholic and represented, at that time, the majority of the board. The first Class A's were John Wood, Frank Amos, and Willard Richardson, a friend of Rockefeller's. Class B trustees were recovered alcoholics, and the first Class B's were a man named Bill R. and Dr. Bob. Now, the key to this proportion is the fact that the majority of the board is non-alcoholic. That was essential for lending any credibility to the foundation. Hank also created an advisory board with Bill, Hank, Leroy Chipman, and Albert Scott, which they hoped would be a vehicle for Bill and Hank to steer the board. Well, or so they thought. When you read the charge to the Alcoholic Foundation's board, you can see why I said Bill and Hank sort of gave up on the idea of hospitals and sanitariums. Among the many tasks, the board was expected to raise monies for the relief and rehabilitation of alcoholics by supporting personal work of religious but non-sectarian nature, places of rest or recuperation for alcoholics. You see, they're hanging on to that idea. Financial assistance to alcoholics. Well, we all love that. Research in alcoholism, and the publication of literature related to alcoholism. Wow, I mean, even for that time, 15,000 is going to have to stretch out a very long way. In retrospect, Bill laughingly said that the Alcoholic Foundation was chartered to do just about anything within the field of alcoholism except lobby for prohibition. They had ambitious ideas. Now, setting up the foundation must have engendered the delusion for Bill and Hank that every alcoholic has. Now our problems are over. And feeling flush with cash that had yet to come in, Bill and Hank continued to seek funding using Bill's story and There Is a Solution as an incentive to invest. But with no success, because the same question was asked again and again. What's the program of recovery? Well, Bill realized he needed to write a program of recovery, but he kept stalling. He started to write other chapters, but not about the recovery program sometime in September. And there's still no other substantial donation coming in. So August to October of 1938, there had been no sign of money coming in. So October 1938, Bill and Hank approached their advisory board colleague, Albert Scott, to try to pressure the foundation for money. You guys get out there and raise money. You've got the connections. But Scott refused to approach the trustees, and he pushed back, insisting that the fellowship should start to pay its own way. Remember that in Bill's essay. It was time for us to pay our own way. So Albert Scott proposed the idea of dues. Well, Hank and Bill were extremely disappointed, but they had to go away and think about Scott's idea. It did seem reasonable, I guess, at first. But after some thought, the idea of dues was rejected by Bill and Hank. They said dues would not safeguard against alcoholism. Working with others would be the only safeguard. They also noted that the families would be resistant against dues when they're just barely getting on their financial feet. And well, the most compelling reason of all to me is finally, who wants to monitor alcoholics' payments of dues? Not me. The miracle of that measured consideration by Bill and Hank is the early AA principle of no dues or fees, when it was only a word-of-mouth program and they desperately needed money. And it continues to be the standard for AA's voluntary system of financial contributions from its own members, when AA now provides services worldwide. Of course, Bill knew its services would never be sustained by AA members' dues and fees, and even their voluntary contributions. Bill and Hank intuitively knew that dues and fees would never work for alcoholics, yet they had to face the prospect that alcoholics would not contribute enough voluntarily for the organization to survive. I like to think about this a minute because when one thinks of other uh, volunteer organizations such as the Red Cross or the American Heart Association. They seek contributions from people who do not benefit. I can send something to the American Red Cross even though I've never used their services. Alcoholics Anonymous is unique in that we only take financial contributions from our own members, and Hank established that very early on with the fund. Now, to understand Hank's next idea, it helps to look back at the original purpose of the Alcoholic Foundation. So, the Alcoholic Foundation, when he first created it, was supposed to raise enough donations, 15,000, to finance the book and do a boatload of other projects, but never mind that. The earlier plan included creating a private marketing organization or publishing firm as a separate arm of the foundation. You see how much these guys were thinking. Furthermore, Hank grandly proposed that if they received more money than needed to publish the book, they would partition and return the excess to the donors. He felt certain that this would entice donors and investors, but it just did not work out. One obstacle after another resulted in his changing this very charitable original ideal into a more aggressive and self-serving fundraising approach. Maybe it was partly out of frustration, but Hank's next idea was the 100 Men Corporation. In October 1938 came the famous stock idea. Now, Hank created stock certificates at a par value of $25 from blanks purchased at a stationery store. That part's true. And at the top of each certificate, he did sign his name, Henry G. Parkhurst, President. And then he issued 200 shares for himself, 200 to Bill, and he hoped to sell the remaining 200 shares at $25 per share. Selling those shares would give them the $5,000 they needed to get by financially and to print the book. If there were real money involved, this would be pretty astounding. But for sure, Hank gave himself and Bill controlling interest in the 100 Men Corporation. And because of that, that would raise eyebrows in AA and outside of AA for many years to come. And of course, Bill and Hank were working under the trustees' radar. They knew nothing about this, but it didn't matter because no one was buying. Now here comes a very important detail that I did not know, but thanks to William Schaberg's hard work in writing about the history of writing the big book, there's a detail that every AA should know. Hank, after that, when no one was buying, wrote a fairly well-organized and convincing prospectus that added more legitimacy and transparency to their efforts. In late October into November, the prospectus was ready, and Hank also offers a monthly payment plan for the stocks. So with more transparency, a little more ease in selling the stocks, by December 1938, the stocks did start to sell. And finally, Bill writes how it works. As a result, 44-ish, the numbers vary depending on the research, stock certificates sold. Now, only 10 of those were to alcoholics. The rest were to non-alcoholics who bought the stocks, and among them businessmen, doctors, people who must have understood the construct of the stock deal. This was for a total of $4,475, which helped to get the book across the finish line. Well, let's take a breath, folks. Notice that we have been at this for 9 months in 1938, Hank and Bill were scrambling to get funds and to get the book written, and in the midst of this scramble, Hank has penned some of AA's most important policies. To be clear, none of those policies involved raising money and selling stock without the trustees' knowledge, but remember, their back was against the wall. It's unclear whether Bill and Hank had discussed with anyone their proportion of control, at least until the prospectus was written, when they first formulated the idea of the stocks. However, considering that many stock-owned companies start with one or two controlling owners, and Hank had written the prospectus, and at least some of the investors had to be aware of and accepted Bill and Hank's majority holdings. Given they were the ones who dedicated virtually all their time and energy to writing the big book and trying to find funds for its publication, their expectation for commensurate compensation was certainly reasonable. And similarly, Ruth Hawk received free shares for her extraordinary services rendered while the flying blind period was going on. Still, the stock deal dogged Bill's steps for many years to come, and I can't help but think it was mostly due to lack of transparency about the stock idea from its inception and for many years after. The lack of transparency started dominoes falling that made it harder to discuss this fully. We touched on why Hank and Bill hid the idea when it started, but that lack of transparency continued well after the publication of the big book, and we'll get some idea of why that was. Well, we already know that from the beginning, not everyone was aware of the stock deal. Dr. Bob had approved of it, but withheld the scheme from Akron and Cleveland. Clarence S. and his Cleveland group did not find out about the stocks until the pre-publication manuscript came out. This caused such dissension within the fellowship and much suspicion that some of the members were seriously considering breaking away to form their own program. Therefore, the unraveling of the tale was starting to go out of control. This, along with other complaints, created an almost insurmountable fissure in the fellowship, and it went on for many years, and it wasn't helped by the muffled retelling by the early members. Now, eventually, it played out that Hank became the villain, but even though Bill claimed that he protested these irregularities, William Schaberg eloquently says, characterizing Hank as the serpent in the garden of this selfless new recovery movement is just too convenient, completely ignoring the fact that Bill undeniably accepted the apple Hank offered him and took a bite. About 4 months after the book was published, and before sales started to gain momentum, and I think here is where the need to be less than transparent seemed compelling, Hank drank. And unfortunately, in his anger and his bitterness, he ignored Bill's and others' pleas to come back to the fellowship. And ending the stock scheme doesn't end AA's troubles. Early in 1940, now it's clear the book is going to make a lot of money. Then Bill and the trustees realize that they've got to get the stocks turned back over to the Alcoholic Foundation. But Hank held out, so we now have an active alcoholic who owns 1/3 of the book. He held out until he was desperate for money, and so it goes with active alcoholism. So by 1942, the foundation, with the help of a Rockefeller loan, purchased or were given the remaining stocks. The foundation thereby did assume ownership of both the publishing company and the book, but the road getting there was pretty rocky. It's not clear to me why no one talks about the tremendous financial implications of Bill and Hank signing over their own shares with no compensation. Hank wasn't exactly willing, but he did sign over his shares. Bill wanted to sign over his shares, but not without the stipulation that Dr. Bob and Ann continue to receive royalties. Later, Bill would receive royalties, which added fuel to the burning resentments Hank already had. Hank's drinking further alienated him from the fellowship, resulting in many members becoming supportive of Bill getting the royalties. That income was modest at first, but eventually Bill and Lois received substantial income. According to Hank's son, sadly, Hank would always feel that the fellowship and Bill treated him badly. However, Bill's royalties kept him at headquarters trying to help the struggling early groups, and in the meantime, AA's budding unity was starting to disintegrate due to the discord within the fellowship. It was another reason not to talk transparently about the stock deal, or talk about it very much. And unfortunately, even without talking about it, the consequences of the stock scheme were imminent for Bill and Dr. Bob. So let's go back before all this mess started to unfold, back when things looked so promising in March 1938, and they're looking forward to getting this money from Rockefeller. Hank then recommended that the fund should have a definite procedure for handling money that would be above reproach should hostile parties later make any investigations into their affairs. He established auditing for the fellowship. Hank also cautioned that the distribution of these funds needed to be fair and impartial, avoiding paid professionalism, while at the same time forestalling all jealousies and political possibilities. Well, then, ironically, let's go 4 years after that. Around 1942, Hank fomented anger and suspicion in an already disgruntled Clarence and others in Cleveland. So, how do you level accusations of stealing? You invite the accused to speak at a dinner, like honored guests. We're honored to have you speak, but oh, wait a minute, let's pull you into this back room and we're going to let you have it. Bill and Bob accepted an invitation to speak at a dinner in Cleveland. They noticed the attendance was small and there was a palpable chill in the room. And after the dinner, their talks, the chairs of the various groups escorted Bill and Dr. Bob to a separate room. In the presence of an attorney and a certified public accountant, the distressed chairs claimed a trustee at the foundation had shared awful stories. Among several heartbreaking accusations about the withholding of the incredible profits from the big book, along with a list of other accusations, they claimed Bill and Dr. Bob received $64,000 in money in the past year. They made truckloads of money off the book. Well, obviously, Bill had some inkling that this was going down because he just happened to have with him a certified audit, a custom and practice established by Hank 4 years ago. When their lawyers, the chairs and their lawyers and their accountant read the audit, they were chastened. They said, oh, okay, well, we can see everything's okay. And, oh, gee, we didn't really believe the accusations, but, the damage had been done. So they did promise to go back and set the record straight. And we know now, today, even today, there was no happily ever after. But as Bill said, all was forgiven. It just wasn't forgotten. So yet again, this is probably not a good time to be fully transparent about what happened with the stocks, especially with this audience and this rumor mill going on. Ironically, Hank laid the groundwork for AA's corporate poverty, self-support, and fiscal responsibility. It was Hank's foresight that a few years later saved Bill and Dr. Bob and the fellowship itself ultimately from anyone who would accuse them of financial improprieties. Who knew that one of the first accusers of financial improprieties was Hank? As heartbreaking as all of this must have been to Bill and Dr. Bob, Bill chose principles first. He tempered his sadness by defending his accusers, a principle we should all remember that in their defense, he said, some were genuinely distressed by what they regarded as an attempt to commercialize AA. Bill thus learned the hard way that transparency in financial affairs was essential and that it was always important to set the record straight. Bill applied this to his own personal finances. So from this bitter experience, Bill wrote in the AA Tradition pamphlet that the use of money in AA is of the gravest importance. Where its use ends and its misuse begins is the point we should vigilantly watch. So remember the part of the long form that says the acceptance of large gifts from any source or of contributions carrying any obligation whatever. This is a nice segue into talking about the original Big Book manuscript, which is a large piece of property. Now, the manuscript belonged to Lois and Bill, and in 1978, Lois gave the manuscript to Barry L. Barry L. was grateful, and he wrote in his will that the manuscript actually belonged to the AA archives, but he was keeping it until he died. Well, Barry died in 1985, but no one seemed to remember this, and no one seemed to know where the manuscript was until it surfaced in 2004 for auction. It sold for $1.5 million, and then it was sold again in 2007 for $992,000. The backstory involves AA members, of course, who were trying to protect this important piece of history. That included one member getting a copy of the manuscript published in the book that started it all by an outside publisher in 2010, so everyone could at least see this document, albeit 1 degree removed. Then, in 2017, the manuscript reappeared for auction again, which set in motion troubles and woes aplenty for our General Service Board and for the conference delegates. The trustees immediately tried to block the sale and to litigate AA's ownership of the manuscript, and ultimately they were unable to secure its ownership. The end result was that the auction was able to proceed with a $2.4 million sale to a private owner, and that left AA with substantial legal costs and dissension in the conference. Fortunately, the then owner of the manuscript, very generously shared it at events and viewings, but it is a shining case of how a large and valuable piece of property caused substantial problems for AA. Well, recently that owner has passed, and it appears that the manuscript, along with his other memorabilia, may come up for sale again. So keep your eye out, AAs. If you've got the money, you can buy the manuscript. So, what are some of the takeaways for AA treasurers or anyone who is handling AA funds? That means support should come from the group, never from individuals. There should always be clear records, no matter how small or how large the group. There should always be regular financial reports, no matter how small or how large the group. And substantive financial decisions should be made by the group wherever possible. This is all especially so that the newcomer can see that there's transparency and that there's receipts, that we are financially responsible. Equally important is the means of self-support. Self-support comes from the group, but not just financially. Self-support points directly to Tradition 9, which we'll talk about soon, about committee service, service that helps to run the meeting, rotation and participation by all group members. This is something that's important for the newcomer to witness. On a personal note, I learned about the ego-feeding proposition of myself as an alcoholic and money. I purchased cups, coffee, and other supplies for a group. I declined reimbursement. It was a donation to the group, and my motive was to be helpful. But upon studying this tradition more closely, I realized that even though my motive was to be helpful, I deprived all other members of the group responsibility for sharing the group's expenses, for the group being self-supporting, and for making the group reliant on my contribution. I introduced an element of unpredictability in terms of operating costs for the group. Now I can admit that part of it was sloth. I didn't want to bother with receipts, and part of it was ego. But I know now that none of it was good for the group. Bill says we don't need money. The core of the AA procedure is one alcoholic talking to another, whether that be sitting on a curbstone in a home or at a meeting. It's the message, not the place. It's the talk, not the alms. Coming up in the 8th tradition, we will see how money continued to plague AA well after the flying blind period. Bill referred to this next period as AA's biggest test for the unity of the fellowship. Could there be an Alcoholics Anonymous World Services if AA did not appropriately compensate its members and others to help make 12-step work possible? For comments and questions, or if you want to be on a mailing list for workshops, please contact me at whatslenderthreads@gmail.com. And for other resources and workshop flyers, please see www.onwhatslenderthreads.com. And thank you.